Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight's program is a collaboration between the National Museum of African American History and Culture and NPR Music, and explores the impact and legacy of African American women in rock and roll. My name is Dwandalyn Reese. I am the museum's Associate Director for the Office of Curatorial Affairs and also Curator of Music and Performing Arts. I also curated the Musical Crossroads exhibition here in the museum. The goal of the Musical Crossroads exhibition is to give visitors an opportunity to learn the meaning and purpose and role of African American music in the African American experience. It also shows how that music has shaped the social, cultural, and musical landscape of the United States. African American music has and continues to be a call for liberty, justice, and social change. That call was the foundation of rock and roll. Unfortunately, that story is frequently overlooked when we tell the story of rock and roll. The erasure is multiplied further when discussing the contributions of African American women. Musical Crossroads highlights the many African American musicians presenting a diverse array of musical forms in which many women are centrally identified. In the exhibition and in our collections, you'll find such figures as Nona Hendrix, Big Mama Thornton, and of course, Tina Turner. The museum has reopened and has taken measures to ensure the utmost safety for all of our visitors. If you have an opportunity to travel to Washington, D.C., or just live in the area, please stop by and come to the fourth floor to see the Musical Crossroads exhibitions, in addition to the 11 other exhibitions we have in the building. You'll find recordings, albums, photographs, and other archival materials within the museum's collection that document the history of African American women in rock and roll, the same subject that will be covered in our conversation tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce Maureen Mahon, a professor at New York University and author of the book Black Diamond Queens, which was just recently published by Duke University Press. In Black Diamond Queens, Dr. Mahon uncovers the hidden history of Black women in rock and roll. She examines how gender, race, and sexuality affected the careers of women discussed in her book. Dr. Mahon is joined in conversation with Ann Powers, journalist and cultural critic at NPR Music. Ms. Powers also developed the NPR series Turning the Tables, that remedies and corrects the historical record and puts women at the center of popular music. Black Diamond Queens is available for purchase at Duke University Press. Just go to their website, dukeupress.com, and use the coupon code FALL2020 for a 50% discount. This discount is good until November 23rd. And you can learn more about Turning the Tables by visiting npr.org. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Maureen, I'm so excited about this book because it really changes the conversation about rock history. There's been a lot of writing about marginalized figures in popular music, but you give us a model to really recenter the conversation by putting different people at the center of it. Can you talk a little bit about how you developed the method for writing this book?
Wow. A method, you make it sound like I was so organized. I actually started working on the book before I knew how to write the book. I started working because I was talking with contemporary African American women who were doing music that wasn't easily slottable into the R&B category, which was the category that they were expected to be working in. So in the courses of our conversations, we would talk about the women who came before them and what did they do and how did they get their careers going and what kinds of struggles did they have. And so I found myself getting very interested in those women. So I really at first was just looking for stories about African American women who were doing this music, rock and roll, more experimental things that were not always understood as African American. And while I was doing that, or as I was doing that, I was starting to understand that there was a reason that women who were very much at the center of rock and roll in the early years were being pushed out in the historiography and the way that we tell the story of rock and roll. So that led to me thinking about the importance of recentering the women, as you put it, putting them in the middle of the story and looking at what kinds of connections they had with other musicians, who was influencing them, and then also very important to me, who did they influence and who were they interacting with?
Why do you think the label R&B is so tenacious when we talk about Black women musicians?
Well, I think it has to do with the way popular music has been marketed in the United States since the beginning of the time that African Americans were understood to be a potential market. In the 1920s, there was a new genre of music, and it was called race music. And this was music that was performed by African Americans, and the perceived audience was African American. And that model has stayed with us even to this day. So at the same time there was race music for African Americans, there was also something called old time music. Eventually it got called country music for working class, Southern, white Americans. And then pop was the mainstream market for presumably white Americans. So that racial marketing has always been a part of the way music is sold, the way artists are signed, and the way audiences are perceived. And it's been very persistent in the same way that racial segregation has been very persistent in the United States. So the assumption is when you see an African American woman who's a performer in music, the assumption is she's going to be doing a music that is associated with African Americans, whether that's R&B or maybe it's jazz, maybe it's rap or hip hop. But there's an assumption that the race of the person is going to determine the style of music that they perform.
Throughout your book, you use many different examples of how different women performers gave us tools to understand emotionality in music, virtuosity in music, all of these fundamental qualities. But it is interesting to me, you know, how those terms get defined in terms of certain categories, like what is soulfulness versus what does it mean to be a rocker. And it seems to me that that discussion is at the center of this book. We'll get to some specifics soon, but was that an overarching concern for you? Just like what the meaning of these terms is, how the meaning of these terms change when attached to different definitions of music.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the terminology is that it does change. It's very fluid. I think I was less interested in looking at how language like being soulful shifted than I was interested in seeing that the quality of soulfulness was something that people wanted to hear in African American women's voices. And if that wasn't present, then there was a perception that there was something missing and that this artist wasn't going to be able to fit. The artist didn't fit into our expectations, and the artist really then couldn't be sold. And the person who really, I think, embodies this sort of quandary is Betty Davis, who was very intentionally not singing in a soulful style. She had another mission. She had another thing she wanted to express with her voice. But when you saw her, you saw this beautiful young African-American woman with a big afro. She was working in the early 70s. There was an immediate expectation that she was going to sound a particular way. And the vocal sound that she came up with was quite different. So she didn't have a soulful voice, and she said, you know, I don't sound like Aretha Franklin. That's not what I do. I'm a projector. And so she was almost like a performance artist in the way she was using her voice to convey certain mood, to convey an attitude, to convey a certain kind of energy, a fierceness. And that kind of play with the voice wasn't what people were looking for African American women to do in the early 1970s. And as a result, she really struggled in her career to find a fit. She had an audience. She had a sort of like a cult figure status. But she didn't reach as many people as she might have had she been marketed, for example, as a rocker, because she was doing the kinds of experiments that you would expect in that field. But because she was an African-American woman, a person you didn't expect in rock, she didn't get that opportunity.
And Betty Davis is often talked about too in connection to jazz, purely because of her personal association with Miles Davis, when she really, to whom she was married for a time, while she never was really a jazz musician. It just shows how these categories are kind of slapped on sometimes.
Right. Well, we need categories to talk about anything, but especially with music, we're in this, we have this habit of using categories and labels to talk about music and to explain what it is, because music is difficult to talk about. Music is its own language, and then we're using this language of words to try to speak about it. So it is challenging, and so we talk about what music sounds like by likening it to something else, and we think about music often in this way too, just by categorizing it, different artists together because they sound similar, or because they have a similar attitude, or because they've come out of a similar or related community. But it's a challenge to talk about music. And so one of the fallbacks is these categories. And the categories, in many cases, get in the way of what the artist is trying to express and the audiences the artist might be trying to reach.
Let's go back to the very beginning of the story you take up, which is at the beginning of rock and roll as we define it. And you take on a famous story about exploitation, about marginalization, about a woman who, has been celebrated, but also often held up as kind of a victim, Big Mama Thornton. And the picture that you paint of Big Mama Thornton is not at all, of a victim. I mean, you really bring her to life as this strong, incredible character. So many people know the story of Big Mama Thornton as the woman, who first recorded Hound Dog, and then Elvis went on to become Elvis through that song. What is the importance of telling this bigger story about this artist?
Well, I think there are many great things about Big Mama Thornton, and one of the things I especially love and that I tried to convey in the book is that she always maintained her ownership of Hound Dog. It was a song that she believed was her song. When the song was presented to her, when Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller presented the song to her at a recording session with Johnny Otis, they said, "This is the song we wrote for you because, we saw you and we got this," basically they were saying, "We got this vibe off of you and we wanted to give you this song." And she did things in that song that weren't written into the song. So she did some improvisation. She always took ownership of that. And then in later years, when after Elvis Presley had performed the song, and as you said, became Elvis as a result of that, because that was his biggest hit, that was his biggest selling record, his performance of the song on national television really put him into the national spotlight. So it was, people thought of it as his song. But she would always claim the song, and in her live performances, she would talk about how I am the one who sang this song first, basically saying, I am the originator of this song. And I think that was an important thing to do. She never really got paid very much for that performance. She didn't see a lot of money in terms of royalties. Her career is a story of struggle in a lot of ways, but she was a performer, through and through. That's what she wanted to do, and she just wanted performance opportunities. And her frustration was that because of timing and because of her race and her gender, she just didn't get the opportunities that Elvis Presley got. She also had a connection to Janis Joplin, who was more open about what she owed to Big Mama Thornton. And so she had a much more positive Big Mama Thornton had a much more positive feeling about Janis Joplin because Janis Joplin asked her permission to record the song Ball and Chain. And Janis Joplin invited Big Mama Thornton to perform on the stage, to be an opening act. And there's an irony in Big Mama Thornton being an opening act to Janis Joplin. But Joplin was trying to recognize in a public way her debt to African American women performers. So they had a different type of connection.
I mean, the relationships between white rockers and black rockers in the 60s and into the 70s is so complicated. What a complicated dance. But before we get there, I don't want to leave the 50s yet, because I want to talk about LaVern Baker and Black women in early rock and roll, the way you tell that story through the story of LaVern Baker. I mean, honestly, it blew my mind. It made me question my own work, because centering her and centering performers like her, like Ruth Brown, Dinah Washington, really changes the way we understand rock and roll. And even those of us who are trying to do anti-racist work in this area, who might have critiqued early rock and roll for pushing women out, well, you're saying, no, just look at the evidence. Look at posters from the time. Look at radio playlists. They were there.
Right. And it's something that we don't know. We can't even say we forget. We just say we don't know, because that story has gotten lost over the years. Because rock and roll, if we do talk about it, we may mention, the litany: Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Bo Diddley. The women get put to the side. But the women were really important figures, and there were a lot of rock and roll tours and a lot of rock and roll concerts in the early days. And these were very different from the kinds of concerts that we're accustomed to in the 21st century, in the sense that there were so many artists on the concert, and they only performed a few songs. They were maybe doing 3 songs in their set, 4 or 5 if they were one of the headliners. And so with LaVern Baker, you have this artist who is one of the very first rock and roll artists. Prior to 1955, the music that she was performing, and also people like Big Mama Thornton were performing, was called rhythm and blues. You get this name change in the 1950s, and it's in the middle 50s, and it's so interesting to see how the first rock and roll artists are almost exclusively African American, but we've lost sight of that through the sort of arrival of Elvis Presley, and our awareness sort of shifts, or our assumption shifts about who a rock and roll artist is. But in the early days, you have these rock and roll tours, and one series that LaVern Baker was a part of, she was the second headliner. Fats Domino was at the very top of the bill. So she was at that level. She was recording on Atlantic Records. She was one of their really big stars. She was the first of the Atlantic Records stars to have a pop chart hit, as opposed to being on the rhythm and blues chart. So she was crossing over. And she was someone that through these tours in the 1955, 56, 57, was bringing rock and roll all across the country. She was one of the first people to perform rock and roll on television. So she was a real path burner in this music, but she completely disappears. And I think that part of it is because we've developed an idea of what rock and roll attitude is, not just what a rock and roller looks like in terms of race and gender, but also the sort of attitude. And we expect, screams and shouts and maybe kind of wild movements. And LaVern Baker didn't do that. That kind of possibility wasn't really available for an African American woman who was in crossover mode. So she's more restrained in her performance, and she's also, in her appearance, looking very elegant. She wears gowns, her hair is always perfect. And that doesn't look like rock and roll to us. We have this sort of different idea. Frankly, if you look at everyone who was performing rock and roll in the 1950s, they're very dressed up in, very fine suits. The men are almost always wearing ties. So there's a kind of formalness that we don't think about from the perspective of having lived through the 60s version of rock. And so I think that also leads to losing some of the women because their appearance, their demeanor didn't equate with what we consider rock and roll. But in the moment, that was rock and roll.
While you were talking, I had to grab my notebook because I recently read Sarah Broom's book, The Yellow House, and one line in that book, which is about a family's life in New Orleans and about how things are lost and how things are found. She has this line where she says, "Nameless is a form of naming," and I feel like that's exactly what you're talking about, and that's such an important thing to think about as we tell the history of popular music.
Yeah, yeah. It's parallels the saying, "Anonymous was a woman."
Yeah, yeah, so true. Well, that is a great segue into the '60s and the late '60s and early '70s and Black women in the counterculture. I've been thinking a lot about how the counterculture has been whitewashed historically beyond music, beyond popular culture. For example, the thriving cultural side of the Black Power movement in the Bay Area has rarely been acknowledged as existing simultaneously and intertwined with the Summer of Love over in San Francisco. I mean, there was Sly Stone right there, and there were the Pointer Sisters right there, but we forget about them. You're writing on the way that certain Black women artists are fundamental to the sound of '60s rock, helps us see the countercultural moment differently. So I guess first I'd ask you just about that. Like, what does it mean to be a Black woman in the counterculture, and what role did Black women play in the cultural side of the counterculture?
So I think about the presence of African American women in the rock scene at the end of the 1960s in a couple of ways. At one level, I'm really interested in their sonic contribution. Mm-hmm. And in the book, I talk about the very important role that Black women played as background vocalists on what we now call classic rock songs. So I talk about the sort of early days in the 1960s when you started to hear these Black women background singers, groups like the Blossoms and the Sweet Inspirations on recordings. And you would actually saw the Blossoms on the television program Shindig. And that was really extraordinary because you had these three Black women on stage performing, in many cases, with white artists. Now we don't think anything of that, but at the time it was really controversial for Black and white people to be in social space together and to be on stage together. Many of those rock and roll shows that we were just talking about couldn't play in certain towns in the South because they were integrated shows. Or when they did play, the white artists did not perform because they couldn't be on stage with African Americans, and the perceived stars were the African American artists. So in the 60s, you still have this interest in having a kind of African American vocal sound in the music, but you also have white artists as the main performers. And so the way that you get that African American sound is by bringing in African American women as the background vocalists. The classic example is the song "Gimme Shelter" by the Rolling Stones, where they have the amazing vocals of Mary Clayton, who was someone who they called kind of last minute and said, can you have you come into the studio? She comes in and works out her part based on some ideas that Mick Jagger and Keith Richards gave her, but they basically left it to her to sort of figure out how to fit into the song. And it's almost like a duet as opposed to a background part that she sings in that. But if you listen to the music of that period from around 1967, 68, when you first start getting the presence of these African American vocalists into the early 1970s, even into the mid 1970s, there's a really strong vocal presence. And it was a core group of women, or like a collective of women, who were called into different sessions. And then they would call their friends so that they would have a trio or a quartet, depending on what was required. They usually would work out the vocal parts themselves. So they were like session musicians. They weren't, they were usually credited, but they weren't considered to be part of the band. But they were really integral to the sound that these artists were seeking. And you can hear in some of the back and forth between the artists that they're really, the black women's voices are really feeding the white artists and sort of, it's almost like egging them on. My favorite example is from Young Americans by David Bowie. Just the way his singing shifts as he's singing with a group, and it was a mixed group. Luther Vandross was one of the vocalists as well, so it was men and women. But those black voices shift the way, helped him shift the way he was using his voice on those recordings.
I wanted to ask you about the agency of the white male performers who are interacting with these black women, because you use this great phrase where you say, it's as if the voices of these women issued a call for these artists to access different parts of their emotionality, their spirituality, however you want to define it. Sometimes, honestly, to almost cartoonish levels, I feel like. But what is the agency of a Mick Jagger in that situation with Mary Clayton, where, as you also write, he actually recedes into the background momentarily and becomes her background singer. But I don't want to give Mick too much credit, though. It's not like Mick was leading the, liberationist movement for women. So how do we think about the rockers, the rock stars in this scenario?
Yeah, it's probably different for each artist because they're reaching out to these sources for different reasons. But I do think that some of the interest in having these voices and having this vocal presence on the recordings is linked to a long-standing way that African Americans or people of African descent have been figured in the sort of Western European imaginary. So Black people are a repository of a kind of emotionality and physicality and sexuality that isn't available normally to white European descent people. So there's a kind of dichotomy. The Black people are associated with the body, the white people are associated with the mind. And for white people who want to get beyond that, one way to do that is to tap into African American sources, and African American music has been really a central tool for that. So I think there's a kind of exploration that's happening. Maybe it's a kind of exploitation that's happening. Yes. There's a lot of fantasy that's happening. Yes. So there are a lot of things at work in the sort of going on this quest for a kind of Blackness, for this kind of sonic Blackness. I think it would mean different things to different people, but I think it was a resource that they used, and the music that comes out of it is music that we call classic. It's something that it has lasted for many years.
It's funny because when I was reading that chapter where you talk about background singers, my mind went all the way back to the beginning of the story of American popular music as it's been told, and to the ring shout, and to white observers of the ring shout, and also Congo Square in New Orleans, white observers who would enter the dance that enslaved people were doing in Congo Square, and how even then, these white men mostly were, accessing their emotionality through these fantastic connections that you wonder what was the true nature of these connections.
Right. Yeah. It's not something we can know. And I think, the other thing is when we go into the archives and we look at, interviews with these artists, and these are, when we're talking about the classic rock artists, the Mick Jaggers and the Keith Richards and the
Van Morrison,
all of them, they've been interviewed so much, but I didn't find a lot of content about this question. It wasn't something that interviewers thought to ask. And so, one of the challenges and one of the interesting things about doing the research was seeing how close and present these women were, but how they were also not there because they weren't being talked about. It just became a norm to have the background singers, so people weren't thinking about what did it mean to have them or what were they supposed to be providing beyond just this kind of general idea of a sound. It was a cool sound. but why wasn't something that people were asking.
That's a great way to talk about your chapter about the song Brown Sugar, thinking about how these women were so close and so involved and yet made invisible in some ways. Brown Sugar by the Rolling Stones is one of the most difficult texts in the history of popular music, let's say, and you tackle it beautifully. The song fantasizes an intimate connection between a black woman and a white man in terms that are almost impossible to think about today, in terms of it's hard to imagine a song like that being written today, honestly, because it is talking about enslaved women. You talk about Brown Sugar in this really interesting way. You access it through looking at the lives of women who were personally involved with white male rock stars, but amplifying their intelligence, their contributions. Can you talk a little bit about those women that you, in your chapter, Brown Sugar?
Sure. I found myself very surprised to be spending a lot of time talking about Mick Jagger in this book, but that's how it ended up. What
can you do?
What can you do? And it's fine. But I talked about three women who had connections specifically to him. And I did that, because he was the person who wrote the song Brown Sugar and set forward this fantasy about the sexuality of African American women and the desire that white men have to access it. It's one of their most popular songs. I'm not sure that when people are hearing that song, they're hearing all of that content in the song. So in talking about the women three of the women who he was associated with, I wanted to use it as a way to mark the presence of African American women in the counterculture. They were really at the center, these women were really at the center of things. The first figure I talk about is Devin Wilson, who's probably the least well-known because she wasn't a recording artist. She didn't try to become a recording artist. She was someone who was categorized as a groupie, or because of the sort of circles that she traveled in, a super groupie, because she was really connecting with the most high-profile figures. She was most closely associated with Jimi Hendrix, but she also had, she called it a cop. She also had a little time with Mick Jagger. And she did an interview in a countercultural fashion magazine called Rags, where she talks publicly about this score that she had. So she's really just pushing against ideas of respectability and talking about her own pleasure and just the enjoyment she took in being in this scene. So I thought that was an important story to tell, that this sort of liberated African American woman existed at this time and was finding things in the counterculture that were meaningful to her. So it wasn't just a space for white youth. It was also a space where black youth or black young people were engaging. I also talk about a woman named Marcia Hunt, who was born in the US but really made her career in England. She moved there and in the mid-60s, around the same time that Jimi Hendrix went to London. And she was recording with blues-based British bands. She always admitted she wasn't a great singer, but because she was African American and she had a great look, people sort of believed she was a great singer, or they wanted to believe she was a great singer. So she was able to do quite a bit. She starred in the London version of Hair, and that really put her forward into the public eye. And she was photographed, she was working as a model. So she was doing a lot of different things on the scene, but she was really in swinging London. She got connected with Mick Jagger when he invited her to be part of a photo shoot for the promotion for the single Honky Tonk Women. And once he described what they wanted her to do, she said, "No, absolutely not. I'm not going to dress up in skimpy clothes and stand in a bar with you guys for pictures." But they did meet, and she is the only one of the two of them who's told the story. He's never commented on their relationship, but she published a memoir where she talks about the relationship that they had, and she talks about the fact that they decided that they should be parents. So Marcia Hunt gave birth to Mick Jagger's first child at the very end of the 60s, and continued on in theater and television. She had a radio show on Capital Radio, the first years of Capital Radio in England, and really developed a reputation as a really great interviewer, as like a smart, interesting interviewer. So people were listening to her. So she's much more well known there. And then the third figure I talk about is Claudia Lanier, who was a background vocalist, worked with a lot of bands, went out on her own, recorded an album that kind of struggled with how to handle an African American woman who was a rocker. And so there's a more funky side, and then there's a more rock side. But she had she had a really great resume. She had been an Ikette. She sang with Tina when she toured. Once Ike and Tina Turner were doing rock covers in their set. And it was through that Ike and Tina Turner connection that she crossed paths with Mick Jagger. So he pops up in all of these stories. But he's really just representing a sort of feeling that many white British men had about African American women, both in terms of an interest in the vocal sound that they offered, but also these ideas about sexuality.
Celebrity culture is always interested in gossip, and it's many people within the history of rock and roll have been reduced to kind of footnotes because of their personal relationships with stars. But why is it particularly important to tell the stories of these African American women? What do we gain in understanding from seeing Devin Wilson as a whole person and not I don't want to say just a super groupie, because I actually think super groupie was a really important function within the ecosystem of rock and roll. But why focus on this, and why is this important to recentering this story?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something that you've written about, just the sort of the roles that groupies play in making the rock stars seem like stars. It's not just having a bunch of guys who are their fans, but it's having the presence of these women. And these were stylish women, these were cool women. And having them around make the rock stars seem much more stylish and much more cool. So as you put, I like that term, in the ecosystem. They do really perform an important function. For me, it's just important because I feel like there's such a narrow vision of who African American women are. Not just talking in terms of music, but just in general. And so we don't hear the stories of women like this because they don't fit into the sort of the script that we're accustomed to. And I think the way they wrote their own scripts is really interesting, and it's important, and it opens up and expands the way we imagine African American womanhood. So I think just for that reason, it's important to tell this story. And then it's also that thing of saying, but they were there too, and it was meaningful somehow for them to be there too.
Well, speaking of women who wrote the script, I just want to quickly ask you about a band that you treasure, that I treasure, Labelle. Also, speaking of African American women who made their way to England and refashioned themselves there, to me, Labelle is a linchpin story in the way I understand rock and roll. But why tell that story in your book?
Yeah, they were kind of musical revolutionaries. They start out in a very sort of typical space for African American women at the beginning of the 60s in the girl group mode. It was Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells, and they were a quartet. And they were touring on what was called the Chitlin Circuit and also the teen circuit, singing sort of pop songs about romance and broken hearts, and doing pretty well, although they were not superstars. But by the end of the 60s, they were running into a problem because the sound of the music was changing and they were recognizing that they were not in style anymore. And so they understood that they needed to do something to keep up. They connected with their friend Vicki Wickham, who is a white English woman who was very connected to the rock scene in England, and convinced her to manage them. And she agreed to do that on the condition that they would go through some changes, some serious changes. And they agreed. And they were working with this vision that Vicki Wickham had of them being like a female version of the Rolling Stones, where they would sing about the things that were important to young women, even if they were things that were taboo, because they wanted to express this stuff to the world. So that was their sort of their brief. And when they started, they were doing covers of rock songs. They also covered songs by people like Gil Scott-Heron and Nina Simone. So they were dealing with both progressive African American music and progressive white, European music. And at the time, at first, they started wearing sort of just jeans and sweaters and kind of dressing down in the style of the counterculture. But eventually, they shifted to these extraordinary costumes that were designed by a fan of the group, someone who had followed Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells and was also following Labelle. His name was Larry Legaspi. And he said, "Your sound is so amazing, it's so futuristic, but your clothes are just last year. So let me make some stuff up for you." And at first, I was fortunate, I was able to interview Sarah Dash, who is a member of Labelle. And at first he designed some things that were just more like gauzy, kind of flowy outfits. But then he eventually arrived at these costumes that people will refer to as the space costumes. So they're these beautiful silver outfits, very form-fitting and very futuristic. And really, Labelle sort of predicts, they're one of the groups that kind of predict Afrofuturism in the way that they dress themselves.
That's so true. That's well put.
Yeah, the other significant thing about Labelle is that they were writing their own songs. So at this time, the idea that the artists would write their music and perform their music was really coming into its own. It's something that really happens with the arrival of Bob Dylan and the Beatles, sort of building on the model set by people like Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly in the 1950s. But people weren't necessarily looking for women to be doing that. There wasn't maybe as much of an expectation. But Vicki Wickham was really clear that it would be important for the women to write. And so all three, Patti LaBelle, Sarah Dash, and Nona Hendryx, took a crack at writing songs. And so if you look at their album credits, you'll see that there are a couple of songs by Patti LaBelle and Sarah Dash. But Nona Hendryx really emerged as the key songwriter for the group. And so she was able to craft the songs to work with the strengths of the singers that are in the group. They knew each other's voices really well because they'd been singing together since they were teenagers. And so they developed a stage show that was really, really popular, both for the amazing costumes and kind of stagecraft, the way they would arrive on stage. There's one story of Patti LaBelle being lowered to the stage from the rafters of the Metropolitan Opera. So they really put on a show in that sense, but then also in their vocals, because they're working from the gospel tradition. They had all sung in church growing up. They bring that tradition to the rock and roll stage. And then they would, just the way they would perform together, they would be very close together. There was a lot of kind of sensuality in the way they performed. And so the theatricality and the sensuality, the politics, the energy just led them to develop a really strong following of fans. They were especially celebrated by Black, queer youth. But there was really a multiracial fan base. And some of the critics who would attend their shows would comment on how diverse the audience for Labelle was. It was something about the way they put all of these features together that really connected with a vibrant and diverse audience.
I see Labelle as a bridge between rock and disco, between the 70s and the 80s, and really a bridge into our next subject, the transformation of Tina Turner. You can't tell me Tina wasn't influenced by Labelle's look when she came out with her giant her giant wig and reimagined herself. But Tina Turner is a massively important figure in this story that you're telling. You call her the most famous Black woman in rock, which I can't dispute, but I also kind of raise my eyebrows, like, wow, that's a big statement. But but what happens to the story of African American women in rock when Tina Turner enters in the 60s and when she re-enters in the 80s?
Yeah, Tina Turner she created an amazing career. So in the early days, as a member of Ike and Tina Turner Review, she's doing R&B. They're getting onto the R&B charts. They have a little bit of attention on the pop charts. They're constantly looking for a pop crossover hit. And in the mid-60s, she works with Phil Spector, who had done a lot of work very successfully with African-American women vocalists and crossing them over to the pop charts. That would be with the Ronettes or the Crystals. So he loved Tina Turner's voice, and so he got this song for her, River Deep, Mountain High, and worked with her to get it exactly the right way. When they released the song, it really didn't do anything in the United States. It sank, but it was a hit in England. And so it enabled Ike and Tina Turner to go to England, to tour there, to connect with the sort of growing community of white rockers and establish themselves as really important figures. The musicians were familiar with the music of Ike and Tina Turner, but when they saw the performance, when they saw the stage show, they were blown away. And so Tina Turner is just one of the master entertainers who has walked on the earth in the 20th century. And they were really wowed by her. Both her vocals. So some of these guys were already sort of modeling their vocals on her vocals, but then also the stage style, which I think they knew they couldn't do. They weren't really going to be able to dance like her, but there was something about that electricity that really got to them. By the end of the 60s, I think to appeal more to the white rock, to the predominantly white rock audience, they start doing covers of rock songs. So they had always done covers. They used to cover R&B songs, so they just shift their focus, and they were covering songs by the Rolling Stones, by Led Zeppelin, and then most famously by Creedence Clearwater Revival. So their cover of Proud Mary was their big breakthrough hit. So they were on television, on national television in the United States, and sort of everybody knew like those crazy steps that the Ikettes did and the fantastic dancing that the group did, and also the eye-catching, very short skirts that they were wearing and the swinging hair. So there were all of these things that they were doing to really look like the counterculture looked and to kind of convey the energy that the counterculture had. In the 1980s, after she's left Ike and is trying to develop a solo career, she gets some help from an Australian manager who had worked with Olivia Newton-John and helped her career bloom in the US. And sort of similar to the way Vicki Wickham redirected Labelle, Roger Davies redirected Tina Turner and said, okay, you've got to get rid of these background vocalists, and these background dancers. She had male dancers in her stage show. He said, that's no more of that. You can't wear the kind of outfits that Anne Margaret and your friends, Anne Margaret and Cher, wear when they are performing in Las Vegas. You need to look like a rocker. So she developed that look with the black leather, the mini skirt, the denim jacket, and then, yes, the fantastic wigs. So she's always worn fantastic wigs. So she just updated to a more rock look. And very strategically and very consciously said, I want to be rock. I want to be marketed as rock. I am done with R&B. So she was trying to set the terms and trying to say, I don't want to be marketed to a narrow African American only audience. That's what R&B would have meant in the 1980s. She's saying, I want to be a crossover artist, but I don't want to have to have the hit first with the R&B market and then cross it over. I want to start with the rock audience. So they worked to get the kind of material that would allow her to do that. The album was recorded in England. It was recorded with musicians who were fans, long-standing fans of Tina Turner. It's not clear whether all of this would have been possible if she had just stayed in the U.S. and whether a U.S.-born manager would have conceptualized this with her and said, yes, we can do this. I think there's something important about having that outside perspective. And she blows up. That album, Private Dancer, it just connected with people. I guess the critics sort of loved this comeback story, but also it's a really solid album. It's got these great songs and it has Tina Turner's voice, which is always incredible. She doesn't really change her voice. It's the music that she's singing. She always had a very powerful attack. She always had a lot of the features that we associate with rock singing, with really good rock singing. So she just situates herself in rock, and it worked out really well. And so she becomes the first African-American woman stadium star. So I figure I can call her a rock star.
Well, it's interesting to me that this moment when Private Dancer happened and Tina Turner became that rock star is also a moment when in the New York underground and in other American urban undergrounds, there is a different kind of black woman and black man performer coming up through new wave and even punk. And your first book, which was about the Black Rock Coalition, which emerged in the mid-'80s as an activist force to it feels wrong to say this, but to sort of convince people that black musicians could be rockers. That's happening at the parallel moment that Tina Turner is happening. And I'm bringing this up to lead myself into a question about you, Maureen, and your process, because you wrote this great book about the Black Rock Coalition at the time when in your youth you loved punk rock and new wave music, and you weren't that into Tina. You weren't that into a lot of the music you talk about in this book, actually. But what are the connections you now are making between what was happening in the underground that you represent with the work you've done on the Black Rock Coalition and these mainstream stories you're telling in this book?
Well, I think they all share this problem of fitting in to the rock genre. So with Tina Turner, she's making this very conscious choice and having to make an argument that, I don't want to be R&B, I do want to be rock. And she's responding to the same conditions that the Black Rock Coalition was responding to, which was this idea that black people don't belong in rock and that there's no audience for black rockers, that African Americans aren't interested in hearing or seeing black rock, and white Americans aren't interested in hearing or seeing black rock. So they're both dealing with that set of assumptions. They have a different musical sound, and this is one of the challenges of talking about rock, is that it's such a vast category. There's so many different sounds in it. And so, yes, as you said, for my taste, when I was in high school and college, the Tina Turner sound it seemed too mainstream to me. I was more interested in music that would have been categorized, if we were using categories or genres, as either new wave or punk. It wasn't that underground because I was getting access to it, but it was very different from like top 40 music, which was what the Private Dancer album eventually becomes. It was a best-selling album for a couple of years, so it really was an extraordinary document. But I would say that Tina Turner is sort of the exception that proves the rule about the ways that African Americans are handled in the music industry, and it was those rules that led to the organization, the Black Rock Coalition, coming into being. And even the persistence of those ideas about what kinds of music African Americans can or should be involved in continued into the 21st century, leading us to have Afropunk, to have a need for another sort of organization and festival that celebrates the music and gives us access to music by African Americans who are working outside of these very limited genre constraints that are set up for Black musicians.
Well, thank you for that perfect transition to the epilogue of your book and the present day. And you write about Brittany Howard, one of the extraordinary musicians of the 21st century, who came up in the band Alabama Shakes and found an audience among rock fans, and now has moved on to a solo career that is really what, post-genre, a term that I think is both problematic and full of potential. And you talk about Brittany as claiming this space and being sort of not bothered by categorizations and being in a way able to be not bothered, both because of her own incredible talent, but also just because of the shifts in understanding of what music is in the 21st century. So how do you view the possibilities for musicians now through the lens of the historical work you've done and in connection with artists like Brittany Howard who are working today?
Yeah, I think I'm going to try to be optimistic, and we're obviously in a really challenging moment because musicians can't perform live now. We have tremendous restrictions. But there are these possibilities because I think of the way music has been disseminated digitally, and the way the current generation of youth accesses music. They are very aware of genres, but when I talk with my students, I teach at NYU, and when I talk with students, they don't limit themselves by genre in the way that people in our generation, I think, limited ourselves by genre. There was a lot of rigidity and a lot of assumptions. And I think some of that has dissipated. So I think there's more space for artists to be a little bit more experimental if they want to go in that direction, and to tap into sounds that might not be the expected sounds. I think artists have always done that, but I think there's now more space for African American women who have those, tendencies, that there'll be a space for them to be heard. And so I think that's a really positive thing. So, Maureen, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation and taking us through this history. And again, thanks for this incredible contribution to our understanding of rock and roll. I really think Black Diamond Queens is a groundbreaking book that is going to affect many lives and open many minds. I just am so excited it's out in the world. Thank you so much for today. Thank you so much, Anne. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for so many great questions. I'm Ann Powers from NPR Music. Thanks for having us.